She boarded the truck expecting humiliation. She had rehearsed it in the long dark of the hold, the shouted orders, the slammed doors, the smell of oil and metal, the hands that would take her scarf and her dignity as easily as they took the rest of their prisoners' names. Instead, a guard pressed a bar of soap into her palms as the truck juddered across ground she did not know. Hanako held the soap like a small, impossible blessing and wondered whether she'd woken into someone else's war. It was spring of 1945 when the convoy arrived at the camp in Texas. Gates of wire loomed under a low, indifferent sky. There were boots and whistles, the clatter of meal tins, and the orderly march of names called out in a language that folded around her like a hard glove. The barracks smelled of cedar and dust. The other women moved with an economy of motion born of long waiting. Hanako's uniform had been washed, not torn. Her hair, which she had feared would be cut in punishment, lay in a plain knot. A blanket was folded at the foot of her bunk. She walked into this small domesticity with fear still lodged in her throat. The soap sat heavy in her palm that first night. She found it under the thin flume of light and pressed it to her face, to the skin beneath the veil of her thoughts, as if cleanliness could erase the memory of being taken. She remembered the Philippines, the long boat, the shouted names, her mother's face like a photograph she could not tear from her heart. She remembered being a nurse, hands that had steadied, fingers that had closed wounds, and the image of that work returning was both anchor and ache. On the morning of the roll call, she saw him. He stood a few paces off, tucked in the practiced posture of a corporal, his uniform not yet softened by long duty. He was young enough to still look like someone who'd been a small-town son weeks before uniforms had grown into him. James Miller had the kind of hands that could give or withhold. They were steady when he offered anything, a paper cup, a nod, a brief instruction. Hanako noticed him because she had nothing else to look at but faces, and because his eyes had met hers without the hardening that the others wore like armor. His first clear kindness was a packet of lozenges. They were a small yellow thing that tasted of menthol and a sweetness that should not have mattered. She received one from him with the formal bow of a nurse taught to accept what was offered for the sake of others. He did not make a show of it. He simply pushed the packet toward her when she coughed through the dusk of the infirmary, and his fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. That fraction folded in on itself and held both of them quiet. There were others who noticed, quick to form opinions. The women in the barracks whispered like leaves. Some watched with a bitter light in their eyes, thinking betrayal.
Others protected Hanako in small ways. A cup, a patch sewn into a cuff, the placement of a mat, an odd solidarity that could look like collusion. Private Harris watched with a different expression. He looked past protocol to the thing he did not want to see, the softening between guard and prisoner. He liked rules the way some men like weapons. He had a voice that could cut through the chatter, and he used it to gather suspicion like a fruit that was immediately ripe. Language kept a distance between Hanako and the world. English arrived in thin slices, words dropped like pebbles into a well and heard in only faint ripples. Hanako could say yes in a dozen ways in her head, but she could not make her tongue form the simplest requests. When she fumbled with her hands, James took the time to point, to pantomime, and to repeat a single word until she could hold it like a small coin. He drew the word water and rest into gestures and pace. She answered in curt, patient Japanese, and in the small, eager English she wrote in the margins of a scrap of paper. The primer arrived like contraband blessing. It was left in her bunk the way some things are left by accident, and some on purpose. The edges were worn, the binding freckled with dirt, but its letters were clear. She tucked it under her pillow and took it out in the gray hours when the camp was half sleep and half waiting. The primer taught her the syllables of being understood. I, you, go, stay. She practiced alone until the words tasted less like borrowed clothes and more like skin. Sometimes she would find a note tucked beneath the soap in the washroom, one line in shaky English, then a line in her careful hand written back. "You all right?" read one. "Yes," she wrote, "I study." Their notes were clumsy, they were currency, they were secret. Secrecy was a living thing in the camp. Hanako learned to fold messages thin as a moth's wing and press them into seam or sock. She learned to read the minute angles of Miller's face, when his jaw tightened because Harris had said something too sharp, when his eyes softened because the garden had sprouted a carrot. The garden was a patch of earth behind the mess hall where a few vegetables grew in defiant rows. Hanako found in the soil a memory of tending that made her whole in ways a blanket could not. She learned the feel of mud under boots, the way it clung and then released, leaving residue on skin and conscience alike. The carrot she pulled one evening was small and knotted, its orange head still mottled with soil. She wiped it on her skirt and looked up to find Miller watching. He offered a small, wordless nod. She handed him half. It was the exchange of two people who had nothing else to give. The simple act of sharing a vegetable became a testament. It was not romance in the pages of a book. It was survival rendered gentle. Harris did not like their quiet. He started to patrol the garden more often, a scrap of authority clenched between his teeth.
He tightened the inspections, the orders, the watchful distance that made the barracks feel smaller. He would stare at Hanako as if trying to burn the meaning out of her skin. He accused her once, half loud in the mess hall, of looking for favors. The women hushed then. Miller, standing beside the line of men, did not answer with words. He held his posture. He shifted the conversation to another topic. That, in itself, was a small defiance. The storm came in late afternoon, a sudden, angry thing. Clouds rolled low and the sky turned the color of metal. Rain came in hard, desperate sheets, then as a pounding that blurred the barracks into a watercolor smear. Hanako hurried across the garden, a piece of cloth pressed against her hair, her boots sinking into blackening earth. A truck groaned in the distance. Miller had been on the far side, arranging tarpaulin, and when Hanako slipped on the wet slope of the path, he was there before she hit the ground. He caught the sleeve of her uniform and turned her toward him, steadying her against the press of rain. They stood so close that the scent of the soil and the medicinals on his skin braided. Lightning cracked, and for a moment the world was only the two of them and the drum of rain. There was no flourish. He said nothing. He only held her steady until the next breath. The camp around them was a smear of motion. Harris shouted from the fence, his voice small in the scope of the weather. The hold of Miller's hand was a measure of something tender and dangerous at once. Hanako felt the weight of all the decisions that belonged to someone else's uniform. She felt the tug of gratitude and the sharper tug of self-preservation. She learned in that storm the precariousness of closeness. News came in ragged bursts. Reports from radio in the officers' tent, the faces of men who read aloud until the words tasted like iron. There were the words she had feared and the letters she could not bear. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, names that rearranged the shape of home. The camp changed in the way of all things when a war moves towards closure. Quiet calculations, the clatter of trunks, packing. Officials spoke of repatriation, of lists and ships and forms stamped with a finality that felt surgical. Hanako clung to the primer like a map. In the days before departure, they were allowed a thin, private ritual. At dusk, they were led to the fence. The setting sun brushed the barbed wire with kindly color. The air smelled of dust and the last warm breath of the season.
People stood in small groups, said names, avoided eye contact. Miller met her at the fence. He had dirt on his sleeve and the same look he wore when orders were given. He did not ask her to come away with him. No such language belonged in the space between guard and prisoner.
Instead, he did the only possible thing within the bounds that held them both. He pressed his palm for a second flat against the cool metal and held up the little primer he had managed to smuggle. Its cloth cover was smudged, but intact. He looked at her until the sun made a halo between them, and, with the slow, deliberate action of a man who was choosing every word, he traced a line in the air that meant promise. Hanako understood that promise in the way one understands a shadow, as real as anything else so long as the light held. She pressed her own hand to her chest and gave him a look that said yes and keep. Trucks arrived before dawn. They moved like final chapters. Men barked and loaded. The engines coughed life, and the convoy began to mend itself into motion. Hanako stood at the threshold of a truck, the primer under her arm, and as it pulled away, she saw Miller at the fence, one hand above his brow. For the first time, she let herself expect that the world might contain an act of fidelity, not bound to victory or defeat. She let herself believe that small things, soap, lozenge, a primer, could mean more than the badges sewn to uniforms. Her return to Tokyo was a return to a city that looked as if someone had lifted its face and tested its bones. The streets were full of people learning how to live in ruins. Hanako moved through it with the primer pressed against her palm like a warm kernel. She found work where she could, tending wounds, teaching children how to stitch, offering the kinds of ministrations that make a city scrape itself together. She wrote little notes in the margins of her primer, English phrases that had become private prayers. She folded letters she never sent and kept the smell of the camp tucked inside the book between pages. Years passed with the slow, relentless, ordinary cadence of reconstruction. Hanako married practicality and necessity, neither a betrayal nor a betrayal. She taught English to the children who came to her small room, who asked questions that sometimes pierced and sometimes soothed. Every morning she lifted the primer like a talisman and read the sentences aloud until she could make the speech in a voice that did not tremble. Then, in 1952, there came a letter. It arrived like someone knocking on the bones of a door she had stopped expecting to open. The envelope bore an American stamp. Her hands shook in the way the hands of a woman who had held scrubbing basins and bandages for years shake for very practical reasons and for ones that were not. Inside was a photograph, Miller in his uniform, hair combed, the same steady eyes, and a note that was both short and vast. The note said, in small, careful English, "I kept the primer. I remember the carrot. I remember the rain. Can we write?" There was no promise of untroubled life. There was no erasure of the things that had been done and the things that had been lost.
But there was a thread, thin but not snapped, that ran from a bar of soap to a lozenge to a shared primer. Hanako sat very still with the photograph and the paper on her lap. She put the letter beside the primer and for a long time read the same sentence until its sound became familiar and not strange. She wrote back. Her English was careful, her sentences short. She told him the parts of herself that had not crumpled, the work she did, the child who had learned to tie a knot, the garden she kept in a pot on a balcony above a city that still smelled of smoke and new paint. She enclosed a small scrap of paper with a pressed bit of carrot leaf, brittle with memory. She signed in both her script and the English she had taught herself, Hanako. When the second letter came, months later, there were words that braced her in ways the primer could not. Miller wrote about the camp as a place of contradictions, order and tenderness, suspicion and grace. He spoke of Harris in neutral terms, of duties performed, of the small rebellion of bringing a packet of lozenges to a woman who had been a stranger. He did not ask for absolution, nor did he claim to be a hero. He claimed only memory. He had kept his promise to remember. Hanako folded Miller's letters into the primer's pages. She stitched a repair on the binding with a thread of faded blue, and for reasons she did not fully understand then, placed the photograph on the inside cover like a bookmark. The primer was no longer simply a book of words. It had bloomed into a ledger of what had been human. Inhumanity had tried to compress into categories and orders. It recorded that small acts could be an answer to large cruelties, not because they canceled them, but because they proved that people were not reduced to the roles assigned by war. Years later, sitting with the primer on her knees, Hanako would trace the edge of the photograph with a fingertip and think about the fence at sunset. She thought about power and about the place where choice had lived between two people who had been bound by circumstance. She thought about loyalty and what it meant when loyalty was chosen rather than commanded. She thought of the women in the barracks who had watched and judged and in some cases protected her. She thought of Harris and how ordinary cruelty looks when dressed in duty.